Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course, my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains completely underappreciated. And today, we are going to discuss aircraft again, but these are planes that I personally view as a little underappreciated historically. They're planes that kind of fell outside of everybody's radar. Planes you don't usually see brought up in discussions about historical aircraft. And in a lot of ways, that's not really fair to them, as some of them were actually pretty good. And at least one on this list is sometimes called terrible, when in reality, from a design perspective, it was actually really good. But we'll get to that in a bit. Here's 5 of the most underrated airplanes in history. The Vickers Valiant. Starting off with the Royal Air Force, are we? The Vickers Valiant was produced between 1951 and 1957 and was the first of the Royal Air Force's V-bomber strategic deterrent force. The V-bombers were a group of 3 types of bomber aircraft that were meant to be, well, a nuclear deterrent strike force. Basically, they were bombers that could drop nukes on the enemy, but they weren't going to do that unless you made them. Hence the rule of nuclear deterrence. If everybody has nukes, no one's going to be willing to launch one, because then they'll be hit by nukes in return. The point is, a lot of the major countries that were nuclear capable had that kind of deterrent force. The V-bombers were meant to be the Royal Air Force's deterrent force, and they were sometimes called the V-Force, because the UK is nothing if not good at naming things, because it sounds cool. Now, the Valiant tends to fall behind the scenes when compared to the other 2 V-Force bombers, the Handley Page Victor and the Avro Vulcan, both of which look tremendously cool and were much more ambitious than the comparatively much more conventional, for the time, Valiant. That's probably why the Valiant was actually built first. It became operational before the other 2. And both the Victor and the Vulcan are heralded as some of the greatest bombers of that time when it comes to UK aircraft technology. And don't get me wrong, those 2 are great in their own ways, no question. But like I said, the Valiant tends to just fall outside of that. People just almost forget it's even there, because you have these 2 that look futuristic and cool, where the Valiant just kind of looks like a traditional mid-20th century bomber. Like, it's a jet bomber, sure, but it doesn't look like anything super special. But it does have swept-back wings, as well as the tried-and-true UK style of integrating the jets with the wing, rather than hanging them off the bottom of the wing like we do in America a lot. Testing went fairly well with them, and in a twist that I thought I'd never be able to say, when it comes to any military-funded aircraft, all the production models were delivered on time and under budget. What? That doesn't happen. We don't do that in military funding. You were supposed to go over budget, Valiant. Don't you know the rules of this? Well, give it to Vickers-Armstrongs. They did it on time and cheaper, but go figure. But because the Valiant was a lot less ambitious than the other 2, it didn't last particularly long. By 1964, it was found that the Valiants were showing fatigue and crystalline corrosion in wing rear spar attachment forgings. A repair program was underway, but a change in government led to a new Minister of Defense, Dennis Healy. He personally felt the Valiant in particular should be retired from service, which finally happened in January of 1965. Both the Victor and the Vulcan remained in service until the 80s, while the Valiant fell by the wayside. But the Valiant is also notable for another reason, as out of the 3 V-bombers, it was the only one to actually drop a nuke. Yes, really. Not in aggression, but during a test. On October 11th, 1956, Valiant B-1WZ-366 of the number 49th Squadron became the first British aircraft ever to drop a live atomic bomb during the Buffalo R3/Kite test. This happened in Australia, by the way. Do the Australians ever bring that up with the UK, that they dropped nukes in the... I'm just asking. To me, that would be a form of contention, but maybe you gave them permission, I don't know. And sadly, there's only one fully intact Vickers Valiant still in existence. That is B-1XD, 818. It's at the RAF Museum Cosford, on display with the other two V bombers, the Victor and the Vulcan, at the National Cold War Exhibition. The Northrop P-61 Black Widow. Ooh, what an awesome name. See, we can name things cool over here in America, UK. Watch out! We're gonna dump the tea in the harbor all over your naming schemes. This is the Black Widow, the first ever US warplane designed as a night fighter. And they did their jobs quite well. The P-61 Black Widow was an ambitious take on the concept of aircraft, first flying on the 26th of May, 1942. Constructing a plane as a night fighter specifically during that time was bold. Radar technology was integrated into it, obviously, but it's not like they had proper night vision or anything like that. Night flying was a different beast in those times, riskier, more daring, but the Black Widows were designed to do it, and did it quite well. Twin-engine fighters tend to fall by the wayside with a lot of people, I find. When it comes to proper fighter aircraft from World War II, people often think of like the P-51 Mustang, or the Spitfires, or the Hellcats, or even the Corsairs. But the twin engines, like the Mosquitoes, or the Black Widows, tend to get ignored, which isn't fair. Now, their role in terms of being utilized was actually rather short-lived. They were only introduced in 1944, which was towards the end of World War II, and also getting into the time when jet aircraft were starting to become desirable. The Black Widow wasn't a jet. As a result, it didn't last long after the war, being retired in 1954, but it doesn't mean they were bad. It was an all-metal construction, twin-engine, twin-boom design armed with 4 forward-firing 20mm Hispano M2 autocannon in the lower fuselage, and 4 50-inch M2 Browning machine guns in a dorsal gun turret. Now, the thing about the Black Widows was this: they were huge, enormous. If you didn't know any better, you might assume that these were a light bomber aircraft, not a fighter. But they were designed to be a fighter, and that had many people concerned during testing, because no one had attempted a fighter aircraft this big at the time. But it could do it. Now, the A and B variants were a little rough in terms of maneuverability, but a high-performance C variant was also introduced. The P-51 would eventually prove itself, and in fact, there was some debate over whether it was going to be used over the Mosquito when it came to the European theater. The British really backed their Mosquito. They were having trouble producing enough of them, but they did want to use them. And don't get me wrong, the Mosquitoes are great. However, the USAAF insisted that they at least do a competition between the P-61 and the Mosquito just to see actually legitimately which one was better. The result? Well, by a narrow margin, the P-61. I know, no one would ever dare say that these days, because the Mosquito is heralded as a great plane, and it is. But the Mosquito Mark 17, which was flown by RAF crews, was found to be slightly inferior because the P-61 had a slightly better rate of climb and could turn more tightly than the Mosquito could. And it proved to be superior to pretty much everything the Germans and the Japanese had at the time, that it wasn't the next generation of planes, that they just couldn't roll out fast enough for it to matter. The only issue the P-61s really had was managing them, and crews sometimes struggled to land or return from a mission because of the conditions they were flying under. Unofficially, it's credited with the last Allied air victory before VJ Day, which is Victory over Japan Day, the end of World War II. That plane was a P-61B of the 548th Night Fighter Squadron, named Lady in the Dark. Really? You named it that? Oh my god, I love it. A handful of P-61s are still hanging around in preservation at various museums across the United States. One is actually being restored, and I've seen this one personally so I could talk about it, at the Mid-Atlantic Air Museum in Reading, Pennsylvania. This aircraft specifically crashed on the 10th of January 1945 on Mount Cyclops in Indonesia. It was rediscovered in 1989 by the museum staff, and has been undergoing a slow restoration since then. It's actually almost done as of the last few years, and it's an impressive decades-long effort of aircraft preservation. Like I said, there are plenty of others at various museums, and one's even in China. A good plane, despite being overshadowed by both past and future aircraft. The Cessna A-37 Dragonfly, or Super Tweet. Wait, does Cessna even make military aircraft? I mean, when you say Cessna, people just think of, well, a Cessna. That thing right there. But Cessna was responsible for the T-37 Tweet, which was the basic trainer in the 60s and 70s, utilized by the United States Air Force. However, during the Vietnam War, things got, well, difficult. Very difficult. And our military was looking for any kind of option to ease the situation. To be precise, they were looking for a counterinsurgency aircraft, otherwise known as a COIN, and they began to look at the T-37Cs for the role. It was promising, and they'd already knew it was a good plane because they used it for training purposes, but in combat, well, it needed to be modified. It needed to have a much larger payload, better endurance, and better short field performance. Since Cessna had already built the T-37, they awarded a contract to Cessna for 2 prototype YAT-37Ds. The modifications would include stronger wings, 3 more hard points on each wing, larger wingtip fuel tanks of 360 liters, or 95 US gallons, a General Electric GAU 2B/A 7.62mm minigun, Gatling-style machine gun, better avionics for battlefield communications, navigation, and targeting, as well as tougher landing gear for rough field operation. Because of all the changes, the aircraft's weight drastically increased, so Cessna had to double the engine power by replacing the 2 Continental J69 engines the plane already had with General Electric J85-J2/5 turbojet engines. The test results were good, though initially the Air Force wasn't even sure they wanted it anymore, as the situation in Vietnam had changed, but then changed back again to where they needed it, and they were like, no, actually, never mind, we changed our mind again, we would like it now. When they were first introduced, there were some problems. The A-37A lacked the ranged endurance they wanted, and there were some heavy control responses during attack runs, as the flight controls weren't power boosted. As a result of this, Cessna was awarded another contract to design the A-37B, which had all new airframes and were stronger than those of the 37As. They could pull 6 Gs instead of 5, and they had longer fatigue life of 4,000 hours. The Bs were actually legitimately great. They excelled at close air support, saving many a US soldier's life with their ability to swoop in, do damage, and get out before the enemy even knew they were there. By the end of the Vietnam War, they'd flown over 160,000 combat sorties and suffered only 22 losses. An impressive record to be sure. Most of them were sold off to other militaries around the world, as well as some to private owners. There's still a handful around on display at a few Air Force museums, and amazingly, there's a few still in service with the Peruvian Air Force. They actually still use them a little bit. So, yeah, not bad. Not bad at all for such a little plane. The Saab 35 Draken, sometimes called the Kite or the Dragon. What an interesting plane. And it's Swedish! That's right. These are Swedish-built fighter interceptors that first flew on the 25th of October 1955, and they were really ambitious, encompassing a ton of firsts when it comes to aviation. It was the first Western European-built combat aircraft with true supersonic capability to enter service, and the first fully supersonic aircraft to be deployed in Western Europe. It was also possibly the first combat aircraft designed with double delta wings, as it was drawn up in early 1950. It's also the first known aircraft to be able to pull off something called the Cobra maneuver, or what the Swedish called Kort Parad, which translates to short parry. The Swedish Air Force were the first to discover and develop it as a combat maneuver. It was supposed to be used during training to teach pilots how to counter what was known as super stalls, one of the only major flaws with the Draken. A secondary use during combat to get a one-up on a plane that was behind you was seen as possible, and frankly, it's just a really cool thing that these planes can do. Like, honestly, look at that. That's just awesome. 651 of these things were produced, but they tend to fall by the wayside to most people outside of Sweden and other countries that utilize them, namely Austria, Finland, and Denmark. Why is that? Well, there's a couple reasons I would imagine. For one thing, when it comes to casual aircraft historians and plane spotters, people tend to draw towards the larger superpower countries, namely us, Russia, even the UK, and a lot of other European nations. Sweden just tends to fall outside of everyone's radar, and that's totally unfair because Sweden, for whatever reason, is incredibly good at making jet aircraft. Like, legitimately good at it. I mean, they also made the Gripen, and the Gripen is an amazing plane. It's actually one of my favorites. I love that jet. The Gripen at least has seen some international acclaim because it's just that good. But the Draken tends to be forgotten about, which is unfortunate because, again, it was the first to perform the Cobra maneuver. And despite being designed as an interceptor, it proved to be an incredibly good dogfighter as well. It even saw use in the United States as a training aircraft after it was retired from military service. So I definitely think it deserves more appreciation than it gets, as does Sweden in general. They make good planes, okay? Look, guys, as an American, we make really good planes here. We don't make every really good plane here. Look around! It's a big world out there. And Sweden exists. They named it Draken. That's awesome. Come on! The Heinkel He-162. Oh boy. Why would I dare put a German World War II aircraft on this list? In the number 1 spot, and it's the 162? History in the dark. Are you okay? Have you been drinking again? Well, no. Excuse me. I haven't had anything to drink in months. So, yeah, that's A. B. I have many reasons to defend the 162 because I have seen it put on one too many worst aircraft ever lists. And I gotta be honest with you, everyone is wrong about this plane. It's not fair to say that it was terrible. Now, in certain guises, in certain forms, it could be bad, but it had nothing to do with the design. The 162 is sometimes called Volksjäger, which is people's fighter. More on that later. I tend to lean more towards what Heinkel wanted to call it, Spatz, which means sparrow, a much more appropriate name for the plane. As you can see, it's a jet fighter. Ambitious and exciting, jets were new at the time, and there were many things to iron out. For one thing, the position of the jet. One of the things that's often easily pointed out as a problem is where they put the air intake for the jet. It's on top of the plane, not the bottom. This means that when it comes to bailing out, well, there's an inherent risk to the pilot. I don't think it's quite as bad as a risk as people tend to make it out to be, but they're right, that is a problem with the design, but that has to do with the early aspects of jet aircraft, not to do with the 162 in itself. They were experimenting, and they needed to know what worked. And as an airframe, when it's built well, I want to stress this, built well, it's actually really good. After the war, plenty of these things were captured as they were in the process of producing them. Eric Brown, who's notable as a British Royal Navy officer, and a test pilot who flew 487 types of aircraft, more than anyone else in history, by the way, did fly one of the ones that was captured by the UK. He, someone who had experienced more aircraft than anyone else ever, found it to be a first-rate plane, with few vices, as he put it, meaning that the design was actually quite good. You might want to argue repositioning the jet air intake, but besides that, it was a good plane. So why do people keep saying it's bad? Well, that has to do with the emergency fighter program, the people's fighter, Volksjäger. See, when the He-162 is built out of good components, aircraft-grade material, like I said, it's good. But the Volksjäger program meant that this wasn't going to go that well. The main structure of the competing designs for the Volksjäger program would use cheap and unsophisticated parts made of wood and other non-strategic material, and could be assembled by semi- and non-skilled labor. They also needed to be easy to fly, to the point that even glider and student pilots should be able to fly the jet effectively in combat situations. The plan was to use Hitler's youth as pilots, who would undergo a very short training regimen with clipped-wing two-seater gliders. So let me see if I got this straight. You want to build a plane out of parts that are in no way designed to be put in a plane. At all. Just not in any way. In fact, they may be components that would be put in a car. Alright, that's A. B. Then, you want to put untrained pilots in the planes, and then launch them off in the defense of Germany. And you think, somewhere in your brains, that's gonna go well. This whole Volksjäger, people's fighter ideal, tends to overshadow the 162 itself, because Heinkel did a legitimately good job with his basic aircraft design. He was a good aircraft designer, and that's why I tend to avoid calling it the people's fighter, because it associates it with Volkswagen, when Heinkel wanted to call it Spatz, Sparrow, and that's probably more in line with what the plane was. The only flaw that Eric Brown ever noticed was the rudder. He had to treat it with suspicion due to a number of in-flight failures he experienced with the thing. it actually resulted in a crash, as one of the assemblies broke off at the start of a low-level roll. Of the ones that were captured, many of the design elements went into future jet aircraft, because, again, they weren't necessarily designed that poorly. But people just throw it on the worst planes ever list and say, look how stupid this was. I really just think you're wrong about that. It's not a bad plane. It was just involved in a really stupid ideal at the time. The plane itself, though, there was nothing really that much wrong with it. Again, the air intake. Okay, yeah, I see that. I see the air intake. I do. Plenty of the captured examples are actually on display all around the world. In the United States, in the UK, in France, and to date the 162 is actually one of my favorite planes ever. Just because I think the design is interesting, and I think it's nice to look at what planes used to be and how they've evolved over the years. How elements from this design were incorporated in future aircraft, used for more, shall we say, noble means and noble ideals, rather than throwing children into the meat grinder to try to salvage a lost war. Also, I would totally love to be able to fly them in War Thunder, but since War Thunder insists on being fun, yet grindy nonsense, I have never, to this day, ever been able to unlock the 162, even though it's the one thing, the one aircraft in the whole game that I wanted. That's it. It's been like 6 years, and I still haven't unlocked this stupid plane. And of course it's a free-to-play game, so it's gonna do this stuff, but I've played other free-to-play games, and it never took me this long to unlock one thing, and you'll never get my money. I won't pay you for it. You can't take it from me. It's my money. Mine! And with that, a special thanks goes out to all my underwater train finders. Thomas Ward, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Sundew 267, Orange Glass, Joshua Long, Ohio Trucker 1, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoth 444, Arthur Roy, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Consume 131-232, Mr. Black Rose, Travel Typhoon, Master of None, Josh Johnson, Lock Kraken, Twin Fox, Dime Blade 17, Anzac A1, and Dazzy Was It. Till next time, this is Darkness, and to bid you all a fond farewell.